This video deals with the research outline. So if we scroll through this document, we see that the outline contains many familiar areas or parts. You have the intro, you have the thesis statement, a space for background information, you have your first supporting point, you have your second supporting point, the third, if you need a fourth one, which you very well might, and a conclusion. So this, the way this is set up, it allows you to, type in here. So even though it might look like you don't have much space for some of these areas, the document will expand as you type in it. So if we scroll back to the top and we look at the introduction, I've mentioned some things about introductions already in previous videos, but it's a very good idea if you bring a sense of the counter argument into your introduction so that the reader understands a little bit about how people feel about your topic and what some of the opinions are that people have about your topic, and maybe even kind of what prompted you, not in first person, you don't want to write in first person, but maybe the reader could get a sense of the issues that prompted interest in this topic. You'll want to state the thesis statement. The thesis statement should contain a sense of the controversy, a sense of the counter argument as well. The background paragraph, again, you want to help the reader understand the context of your topic. For some of you it might not be necessary, but for others it might be something you want to include. As far as the supporting points that you use, you want to make sure you state what the point is. Provide a topic sentence, what you might consider writing as a good topic sentence. If you have any counter arguments that you need to address regarding this point, then you want to write that here. And you want to give evidence, actual evidence. And then you want to explain how this point, this information proves your thesis. And you want to do that for every supporting point that you discuss. Let me show you an example. So this is my introduction. Okay, now you will notice that it is very long. But it's very long because if I were to actually write this paper, it would be very long. I mean, the paper would be quite long. So therefore, my longer introduction could be justified. The longer the paper you have, the longer the introduction can be without seeming strange. Okay, so if I were writing a shorter paper, I would want to definitely pare this down. Alright, so this is my introduction. Let me just kind of read through that and you'll kind of get a sense of where I'm going with my essay, the kind of approach I'm taking with it. In the 1980s and 90s, America found itself nearly consumed with fear over the safety of its children. Case after case of child sexual abuse presenting groups of child victims and alleged secretive groups of perpetrators arose in nearly every corner of the nation. Famous cases like the McMartin case and the Wenatchee County case in Washington, for which the prosecutors were not able to provide sufficient evidence, exhausted the American public. What has been termed a national hysteria by some subsided by the mid-1990s. Many Americans began to look back on that era as one of gullibility, ignorance, and an almost fanatical concern for guarding the innocence of its society's youngest members. Because an element of these cases featured supposed evidence of and stories about ritual or even satanic abuse, the sensationalism reached a fever pitch during the height of these trials, only to become the source of jokes a decade later. Those who maintained that such abuse had taken place were regarded as fringe thinkers. Thus, the era of American history that witnessed an epidemic of child sex abuse cases has been labeled by some as the 20th century's equivalent of the Salem witchcraft trials, replete with unfounded accusations, misguided witnesses, and overzealous prosecutors. Even today, when a case of alleged child sexual abuse featuring several victims and a seeming conspiracy of violators, or even one eminent individual, like Jerry Sandusky, hits the media, Americans can't help but pause and touch that scar on the American psyche that quietly pleads for caution and reason. The American legal system has earned this cynicism, certainly. But is it possible that in an attempt to err on the side of skepticism and prudence, both it and the whole of American society have become too skeptical? Has America become so incredulous, so sure that such cases lie in the realm of imagination, that even substantial evidence from both America and abroad cannot convince Americans to entertain the possibility that secret cabals who sexually exploit children exist in this country? Okay, so that is my introduction. And I do want you to notice that I try not to overdo it with the questions. Also, the questions that I ask raise important issues that do in fact relate to my thesis, and they can't be easily answered. I can't answer those questions with yes or no. So they're complex questions. Additionally, I do not use a question as my thesis. So, that's really important. Here is my thesis statement. Although the idea of children being traded and sold as sexual objects by a group of well-connected individuals seems like merely a product of what has been called the satanic panic of the 1980s, or tabloid sensationalism, evidence points to the likelihood that such sex abuse rings have existed and still do exist in the United States. Okay, so notice that both my introduction contains a sense of how people just find this impossible to wrap their minds around. They have a very difficult time believing that such organized sex abuse rings, child sex abuse rings, could possibly exist in the U.S. because we have this perception of the U.S. as being really safe and, just all-American, apple pie sort of situation. And we can't imagine that things like this would exist in our country. So some people have just relegated that idea to fiction, total fiction. Also, I'm addressing the sense of controversy in my introduction. I'm also addressing the sense of controversy in my thesis statement by using a word like although. Although people think this is the case, actually, Now, I've decided not to include a background paragraph because I've put a lot of background information in my introduction. So I have gone on to complete my first supporting point information as an example. This is the only one I've done, but I think it will suffice as a solid example to help you. So this is my point. This is the first point I'm using to try to prove my stance that I believe organized child sex abuse rings exist. They're kind of hidden. I think they're kind of hidden. They're underground. People don't know about them. Nevertheless, I think they do exist. Okay, so my first point, sex trafficking of people of all ages is prolific in other countries, so it is likely occurring in the United States too. My topic sentence, my imagined, possible tentative topic sentence for this paragraph is: sex trafficking has been a problem in other countries for years and is a very real problem in the United States as well. Therefore, the idea that minors could be victims is not as unlikely as one might think. Okay. So, I do want you to notice as we move to the evidence that I have just kind of put in information and I've kind of listed what the information is, and then I've put like web addresses in there, and that's more like a reminder for myself so I can go back and insert that information into the research paper that I start crafting. So of course in the research paper it would be much more carefully documented, but because this is an outline, that's I think that's okay. Also, this information is going to be available in my research cards as well. Now, also in this section, you want to make sure that you bring in a sense of the counter argument. When I start thinking about this point, it's hard to come up with, really obvious counter arguments right off the top of my head, but I do know that some people probably believe that trafficking that does occur in the world isn't just for sexual purposes. I mean, there are people who are trafficked to be slave labor, people who are brought into the country to clean people's houses, and basically they're kind of kept prisoner and they're not paid and they don't have documentation, so they can't leave because they're afraid they'll get picked up by the authorities. So there are different kinds of trafficking, but what I'm focusing on specifically in this essay is sex trafficking. So I do write here, some might contend that the trafficking occurring around the world is not really sex trafficking, that it doesn't involve minors, or that a market for the sexual trafficking of children doesn't exist in the United States. We always hear about, or often we hear about, sex trafficking of children in countries like Cambodia or even Thailand. So we might be inclined to think that it doesn't happen in the United States. But I do list some evidence here that helps to refute those counter-argument ideas. So I kind of make notes to myself. I just kind of use, I list A, B, C. I have several. I have all the way through D, or excuse me, E. So I've listed several things here, several sources that I think will help me with my research paper. So there's child prostitution in Thailand. I have that information. I have a quote here, okay? And I've listed the web address so I can easily go back to it if I want. Or so my teacher can look at it if he or she wanted to. Deputy Assistant Director of the FBI states that, and here's a statistic about children targeted for prostitution in the U.S. It tells that 105 children were recovered in just July 2013. 105 children were recovered from sexual exploitation. Here's another one. A 2005 press release from the FBI announced that apprehension of individuals involved in a child prostitution ring in 3 states. Okay, so then we have the quote. So, we have references to rings here going on, and the fact that many of these victims are, in fact, minors. Here's another source from abcnews.com that the average age of entry for female prostitutes into that profession is between 12 and 14 years old. Okay. Here's another one. According to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, of the pornography seized by law enforcement, 19% of identified offenders in a survey had images of children younger than 3 years old. Okay. 39% younger than 6 years old, and 83% younger than 12 years old. So apparently that prepubescent or pubescent age range is pretty popular. So anyway, I have lots of good evidence here. So I want to go on and say how this helps me prove my thesis. This proves that despite the public's willingness to dismiss the existence of such rings, they do exist, and that the ages of many of the victims are below that of consent. It also shows that a demand for material that features the sexual exploitation of children certainly exists. Okay, so that is one point I would want to make. Other points I might consider making, I might consider looking at specific cases where sex abuse rings have been uncovered and then kind of covered up. Okay, that could be another thing I want to look at. So I just have, I have all kinds of possibilities. Another one I might look into is the idea of child testimony, perhaps, and how some people like to say that child testimony is not really credible. But one can show how, child testimony can be credible and children can be believed, especially when the evidence is quite specific. Okay, so it depends on how many points you want to make, but I encourage you to make points that are helpful to you, that seem broad enough, not too terribly specific. Okay, and then, I would have my concluding paragraph. Okay, this little outline here kind of shows you how you weave counter arguments into your supporting points.